On December 16, 1944, at precisely 3:47 a.m., in the frozen Belgian forest near Elsenborn Ridge, Staff Sergeant Robert Merriam felt the unease before he heard it, because 28 months of European combat had conditioned him to recognize that danger often announced itself not with sound but with silence, and that morning the Ardennes were unnaturally quiet. The usual background noise of war, distant artillery, scattered rifle cracks, the murmured movement of men along defensive lines, had vanished, replaced by a suffocating stillness that pressed against his ears and tightened his chest as if the forest itself were holding its breath. And as Merriam led his four-man patrol through frozen mud that crunched beneath their boots, every instinct sharpened by countless nights like this, he sensed that something fundamental had shifted, and then the silence broke, not with gunfire but with voices, American voices, calling for help through the darkness ahead, voices that sounded exactly right, voices that carried the familiar rhythms of home, the flat, honest vowels of an Indiana farm boy asking for a tow cable, the nasal irritation of a Brooklyn mechanic cursing the mud and the cold, and the refined, controlled drawl of a Virginia gentleman officer politely requesting directions to rejoin his unit. Voices so authentic that for a moment even Merriam's hardened instincts hesitated, because they sounded like the voices of men he had trained with, marched with, shared foxholes and coffee with since crossing the Atlantic. And as he raised his fist to halt his patrol and listened more closely, parsing cadence and tone the way a hunter studies tracks, everything seemed perfect, too perfect, and yet nothing overtly wrong. And when the figures finally emerged from the fog, they looked exactly like American soldiers should. 3 men in mud-stained olive-drab fatigues standing beside a Sherman tank that had thrown its right track, their posture carrying the particular slouch of exhaustion that came from days of cold, hunger, and tension, their faces stubbled, hollow-eyed, alert in that uniquely American way born of long exposure to danger, the lean lieutenant stepping forward with his hand raised in greeting, identifying himself as Lieutenant William Hayes of the 9th Armored, and every detail passed Merriam's experienced inspection. The officer's bars dulled by time in the field rather than replacement shine, his insignia worn correctly, the combat badge showing the right amount of wear, the Lucky Strike cigarettes in his pocket bearing authentic PX markings rather than stateside gloss, the Brooklyn Corporal Murphy explaining the mechanical failure of the tank with professional familiarity, the Indiana Private Williams offering earnest explanations about getting separated during an artillery barrage, and for nearly 30 minutes the deception held flawlessly as coffee was shared. Jokes were traded about the cold, complaints were aired about K-rations, and the kind of casual bonding took place that only American soldiers seemed capable of even in the midst of war, Hayes speaking convincingly about letters from his wife in Richmond and rationing problems back home, Murphy talking about his brother's job at the Brooklyn Navy Yard and plans for buying a house in Queens after the war, Williams describing Fort Wayne winters and worrying aloud about whether his father could manage spring planting without him, even the map Hayes produced looking exactly right, with proper grid markings, smudges, coffee stains, and pencil notes accumulated through real field use, and Merriam, despite the faint unease he could not name, found himself responding automatically, giving directions, sharing radio frequencies, nodding along as if this were any other night in a long, grinding campaign, until the moment arrived that shattered the illusion completely, when Hayes casually mentioned they were trying to rejoin the 23rd Armored Division, and the words struck Merriam with the force of a physical blow because he had spent weeks memorizing unit designations, operational boundaries, and command structures for every American formation in the Ardennes, and he knew with absolute certainty that no such division existed, and when he repeated the designation carefully and Hayes confidently confirmed it, even referencing Louisiana maneuvers in 1942, Merriam understood with cold clarity that he was standing face to face with enemy soldiers whose disguises were so perfect that only an error no manual could correct had betrayed them, and though he smiled and wished them luck, he was already reaching for his radio, sending warnings down the line that would ripple outward across Allied positions, and within hours similar reports flooded communications networks. American soldiers who could not name Roosevelt's middle name, MPs claiming authority they did not possess, tank crews with flawless equipment who lacked the unconscious instincts of men raised in American towns and cities. And by dawn it became clear that Hitler had not merely launched a ground offensive through the Ardennes forests, but had sent an army of Americans who were not American at all deep behind Allied lines. A realization that crystallized fully the following morning when Technical Sergeant Joseph Morrison of the 99th Infantry Division manned a frozen checkpoint on Elsenborn Ridge Road and encountered 3 MPs whose uniforms, paperwork, bearing, and confidence were textbook perfect, whose explanation of orders from First Army sounded entirely plausible, yet whose response to a casual question about Detroit Tigers baseball rang hollow to a man who had grown up in Dearborn and understood that real fandom was never generic. And when Morrison radioed ahead suggesting baseball questions be used as verification, the results were immediate and decisive. The 3 MPs detained and exposed as German commandos. And from that single insight, born not of doctrine but of lived cultural memory, an entirely new counterintelligence method emerged, spreading across the Ardennes with astonishing speed as checkpoints abandoned exclusive reliance on papers and serial numbers and instead asked about hometown diners, high school rivalries, radio jingles, sports pennants, and childhood memories, exposing infiltrators with near-perfect accuracy because no amount of training could replicate the unconscious cultural knowledge absorbed through a lifetime, and within days Operation Greif was effectively neutralized, German agents captured, killed, or forced to retreat without completing a single sabotage objective. Yet the victory carried a hidden cost, because German intelligence immediately began studying the very questions that defeated them, compiling massive cultural primers, coercing American POWs into teaching emotional authenticity, and by early 1945 producing agents capable of passing tests that once stopped them cold, a sobering reality that shattered the illusion of permanent advantage and forced Allied intelligence to confront the truth that no counterintelligence method remains unbeatable, even as the principles uncovered, layered identity verification, deep immersion over memorization, and constant adaptation, would permanently reshape intelligence doctrine, influencing post-war institutions from the CIA to modern security screening, and leaving behind a legacy born from a single wrong answer in a frozen forest, a reminder that while uniforms can deceive the eye and documents can fool systems, identity lives deeper, in memory, instinct, and shared experience, making it both humanity's greatest vulnerability and its most enduring defense against deception.